President arriving in England this weekend. The question is, what will be South Africa's message? Let's bring in independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, thank you so much for your time on the lead this afternoon. So we have a seat at this important G7 table. Why is our presence there so important?
Good afternoon to viewers. So generally, we are not a member of the G7 because the G7 is made up of the 7 most economically influential countries in the world, and then there's obviously the G20, and South Africa, obviously, on the basis of economics alone, does not command a seat there. However, on the basis of our strategic importance across the continent and obviously in relation to some of the relationships we have with some of the G7 nations, then we are the type of country that they occasionally tap into for some resources and for some wisdom. So the point of this summit in particular is a critically important one. It is indeed the first summit, G7 summit, since Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump. So there's clearly a lot of geopolitical conversations that are going to be held behind the scenes. But also the two big talking points will obviously be in relation to the vaccine equity question, where we've seen that over the past few months, as the vaccine rollout across the globe has happened, the G7 countries and the richer countries have galloped miles ahead of the poorer countries in the world. And of course, one of the bottlenecks that has been identified is the fact that many poor countries do not actually own the intellectual property rights that would enable them to produce vaccines on their own, even if they have the facilities. So there's been a push that was championed by South Africa and India in particular to say, give us the opportunity or give us the permission to manufacture this if we have the resources. So that's clearly something that President Ramaphosa has to really emphasize as a key talking point, because it is a remarkably important one. The second big talking point is obviously the quest for what we refer to as a global minimum corporate tax rate, because we've seen that over the past few years, the big multinational companies, particularly the ones from the United States, have gone across the globe shopping for low tax jurisdictions, so they haven't been paying their fair share of taxes. So last week there was indeed a conversation that was initiated to say, let us come up with a global tax rate, and 15% is the number that's been put forward. So that's going to be the big talking point at this weekend summit.
All right. So the other thing that the president always takes every opportunity to do when he's on the global stage is to, of course, sell South Africa as an investment destination, a task that can really be hard sometimes. How hard will that task be this time around, Khaya, given, of course, his monumental announcement yesterday, perhaps in his favor, around the energy reforms and today's announcement on SAA?
Very interestingly, if you remember, at the beginning of 2018, ahead of the Davos summit, we had something similar in stature, in that he then said, we are going to overhaul the entire board of Eskom as it was back then. We're going to dismiss a couple of people. Machela Koko was one of those people. And he actually had said back then that it was going to be difficult for him and his delegation to go to Davos and actually start saying to everyone else that South Africa is an investment destination, when they couldn't even deal with what they regarded as a low-hanging fruit in relation to Eskom as it was back then. So quite interestingly, even now, as it goes to the G7 summit, he will certainly have this momentum of these big decisions that have been taken over the past couple of days. The question around Eskom is a remarkably important one. We cannot underestimate the impact and the enormity of what was said yesterday, and also today. The conversations around SAA are now suddenly going to become his selling points. Is going to say, well, the last time we engaged, whether it was at Davos or in any other bilateral forums, I had said that I'm making some structural changes. I've said that I'm making South Africa more investor friendly, and this is what I've done in order to get South Africa there. So actually, over the past 2 days, there's been these particular decisions, but also there's a lot of political capital associated with what you saw yesterday and today, and that political capital is going to be in full flight at the summit this weekend.
Yeah, there are several topics, and you've included some of them. You've mentioned some of them that will be discussed. The COVID-19 is going to take center stage. You've spoken about the issue of the temporary waiver of patents for vaccines, the vaccine equity. What message should the South African delegation be pushing for when having discussions with their counterparts?
I think the main message is that, guys, at the end of the day, the WHO has been very clear about the fact that it's pointless for you as G7 nations or as the wealthy nations to say you've solved your COVID-19 pandemic while there's still a pandemic across the world. We've seen the different mutations of the pandemic, in that it may actually even emerge on your doorsteps in a different format once you thought you had solved it. So the quest for a universal answer to this particular pandemic should be something that gets emphasized. And I think what we've seen also quite interestingly, there is a sense of division within the G7 itself, in that historically they do tend to be of the same view, and you would have thought that most of them would have said either yes to the question of the waivers or absolute no. But what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is that the French president has got a particular view, the British prime minister has got a different view, Joe Biden has got a different view. So it may just be at this particular weekend where somehow we find a consensus on whether this is going to be done or not. And I think that if President Ramaphosa has got a few minutes to spare before or after dinner, he probably wants to be speaking a lot more to Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel, who seem to be the last two people holding out and saying, let us protect the sanctity of the intellectual property rights for pharmaceutical companies. And I think once you can get the Germans and the English on board, with Joe Biden also having made this commitment and Macron avoiding slaps and also going to agree to anything that is said, then we may actually see the WTO coming together at its next council meeting to say we are indeed going to lift the intellectual property rights that are usually applied across the globe.